Academies. It's my honor to introduce Amelia Shachoy. Formally, the introduction is that she has 35 years of experience, and most people that know her from the GAO, but she also has 12 years with the New York City Office of Management and Budget. So she knows that municipal aspect of it as well. And also works at the Department of Education there. She has multiple professional certifications in education and other areas. But I think my introduction of Amelia is she is a person that got interested in this and has really, really made a huge difference. So I really appreciate her efforts. Thank you, and welcome, Amelia.
So I'm just going to give a brief introduction of GAO presenters. Mike Arms, I was in our physical infrastructure group for 10 years out of the time that I was at GAO. And Mike Arms and Matt Cook, who's going to present virtually because he got stuck in Wisconsin due to a snowstorm. Okay, Mike and Matt and I worked together in the physical infrastructure group. Mike is now in a new group at GAO, which is called the Science, Technology, Assessment, and Analytics Group, STAA, where the engineers are working. But we all work together on various portfolio of work at physical infrastructure. And I want to acknowledge the team members who I think are joining on Zoom. Of course, this work does not get done just by the managers, it gets done by teams. And I think Toby Gillett and Lindsay Bach and John Bachman and a number of other people who worked on these reports are on the Zoom call. And so Mike is going to start and showcase a large body of work at GAO. And then I think Matt is going to talk about the recent deferred maintenance work.
All right, Amelia, thank you for the introduction. Again, my name is Mike Arms, and I'm joined remotely by Matt Cook, who, as Amelia mentioned, he intended to be here today, but old man Winter had other ideas. All right, yeah, so just the plan for the presentation. We'll talk a little bit about a couple of the higher level products that GAO has produced in the area of federal asset management, real property. And then we'll kind of delve down into some specific studies that we've done on topical issues that'll should be of interest to people in the real property community. But just by way of introduction to GAO, it is a legislative branch agency. We work for the Congress to produce studies, reports, testimony to aid them in their policymaking, their budget decisions. But we also make our work available. Our work is publicly available, and we're appreciative that those in ALN and the Federal Facilities Council have looked at our work and have invited us to be part of this presentation today. And just to get into the topic of federal facilities, it's impressive just to think of the size and scale of the federal asset portfolio. You know, tens of thousands of buildings and structures across all different types of facility types, from office buildings, hospitals, museums, jailhouses, courthouses, and that's just on the building side before you even start to think about the roads and bridges. So vast and diverse portfolio, billions of dollars annually to operate that portfolio. And it's really that scale and size that has contributed to us recognizing the various challenges associated with operating something that vast and diverse. And in fact, one of the say strategic level things that GSA does on a biannual basis is we produce what we call our high risk list. So this is a list that is intended for us to give to Congress at the beginning of every Congress. So every 2 years, a new Congress is put into place. And what we do is issue a high risk list that identifies areas across government that are most in need of management attention. And currently, the current high-risk list that we have was issued in 2023, and federal real property was one of 37 high-risk topics that we presented to the Congress. So, just think about that for a minute. Across all of government, we identified the top 37 issues that require, or, Congress and the federal government in general should be paying attention to, and federal real property made the list. And in fact, it has been on the high-risk list since 2003. And the slide here shows some of the persistent issues that have contributed to real property maintaining its place on that list for these last number of years. So the topic of excess and underutilized property, we'll get into a little bit more detail on that with some of the specific reporting we've done on that recently. But safe to say that the government has too much property, it's underutilized, and we have a hard time getting rid of it. And the topic of data reliability, kind of a basic thing, but again, you think about the vastness of the federal real property portfolio. There's a lot of tens of thousands of buildings, and the data on those buildings, the inventory information about the condition and location, we found anomalies over time that have called into question kind of the reliability of that data, and those concerns persist. And data reliability is one of the reasons that GAO has identified that it contributes to GAO being a high-risk issue. And facility security, another longstanding issue when you think about the first production of the high-risk list in 2003, right on the heels of the 2001 terrorist attack. So that was certainly one of the initial factors that created concern about facility security. And then more recently, through our work, GAO has identified issues, for example, with the management system that the Federal Protective Services uses for managing the contract guards and training for the guards. So we've again found issues with that system, and that has contributed towards our decision to place this federal real property on the high risk list. And then looking forward to 2025, when the next update of the high risk list will be issued, we're anticipating, again, based on some recent work that we've done on the issue of deferred maintenance and repair and how there's been growth in the amount of deferred maintenance and repair, that might very well be something that we highlight in the coming, the 2025 version of the high risk list that the GAO will be producing. So again, high risk list is one of the high strategic level products that GAO has. And then just kind of to continue the conversation up, talking about some of the higher level important strategic reports and work that GAO has done over time. This is actually a representation of a report or a graphic from a report that Amelia authored when she was with GAO. Asset management framework is what's presented here. And what this is a report that we issued that identified a framework that agencies, federal agencies, can think about in managing their assets. And to kind of draw on what Jim Dieter introduced earlier, is that the purpose of having assets is to create value. So this work that we have is how agencies can go about managing their assets by using these key characteristics to best extract value from those assets in helping federal agencies meet their mission. So just a brief mention of this report, again, that Amelia authored. It exists, and it's a document that can be referenced for those in the federal real property community. And at this point, I wanted to kind of shift the conversation to focus on some of the specific recent reports in that involve topics of federal real property and asset management that might be of interest to those in the community. I'll talk about topics of resilience, then sustainability, and then we'll shift to discussing reports about utilization, disposal, and we'll wrap things up by talking about our recent report on the topic of deferred maintenance. And just again, to restate, I mean, one of the things that GAO is probably most known for is the reports that we produce on various topics. The intent is to give information to the Congress to help them know what's happening with the various programs that they're authorizing and that they're appropriating dollars for. And we often make recommendations in our work that are intended to help the agencies, recommendations to the agencies that are intended to help them maybe make changes to improve their management processes. So I'll talk about, again, some of our recent reports and some of the recommendations that we have for agencies that, again, are intended to help them better manage their real property assets. But the first discussion on the topic of resilience, and this was I think, topic that Daniel kind of teed up in his presentation. There's certainly, concern among asset managers about climate change and the growing intensity and severity of extreme weather events. So this is a report. What I'm showing here is a graphic from a report from work that we did in looking at the State Department. And you think about the State Department and its concerns about resilience to extreme weather events. They have a particular need and a particular vulnerability when you think that they have they're an organization with assets literally worldwide. They have embassies in approximately 300 locations around the United States. I'm sorry, around the world. And what we did in this study of the State Department is looked at what they call their Climate Security and Resilience Office has done. And they've pulled information about the various weather hazards and other type of natural disasters that could occur, taking local data on things such as heat and wind and water levels that could lead to flooding, data about earthquakes, landslides, and tsunamis. So there were 8 specific climate or natural hazards that they gathered kind of site-specific data for. And then they coupled that through an analysis with information about the assets, right? The location of the asset, the condition of the asset, and how the placement of the asset in an area, looking at things such as the reliability of utility services and the availability of medical care. And based on that information, site-specific about the asset, plus what was available about what was known about the various climate and other hazards, they were able to develop a risk dichotomy, which is represented by this scale here, by this graphic here. So the kind of the darker, broader circles, areas of or places, locations where the State Department, its assets are most at risk. And you kind of see the scale there shown on the chart. And another representation of the State Department's analysis is shown on this graphic here, which is more of a linear representation from low risk to its posts that are relatively at higher risk to disruption from these type of extreme weather events. And I'll note that the post shown most at risk is Manila in the Philippines. And when you think about that post, it's Philippines themselves being an island nation in a seismically active area, and the embassy itself is right on the waterfront. So all those conditions contribute to it being, again, the post that is most at risk to some disruption from extreme weather events. And that was actually a place that we visited in doing this work. And sure enough, when we were there, there was a big rain storm that occurred that actually caused flooding. So we were able to observe real time actual disruption to the post from that rain event. And this is really a good news story, right? I mentioned earlier that we make recommendations to help agencies better manage their programs, but I think this is an example of an agency really being proactive in trying to understand its exposure to risks from climate and natural hazards and developing this type of analysis. This is the State Department's analysis that we're presenting, and we just have the graphic to show what they did, but the State Department is developing this kind of level of knowledge, and they're positioning themselves to use it, right, and deciding what, when it comes to making their capital plan, knowing where there may be greater vulnerability to the effects of climate events. So they're positioning themselves to be able to make better choices, better decisions about how to spend their resources. So that's the resilience topic I wanted to cover. I'm going to shift gears now to talk about sustainability. And there's certainly a long history of agencies taking steps in response to legislation and past executive orders to do things like use less energy, conserve water, reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And this graphic represents the General Services Administration and its progress really over the last few years to increase the count of its sustainable buildings, and both by count and by square footage. And the GSA has a process to look at energy use, water use of its buildings, and compare to a baseline. If there's enough progress made to reduce, say, energy use against that baseline, they can categorize that building as sustainable. And as this graphic shows, they've been making progress, right, in increasing their count of sustainable buildings by improving their operation, using less energy, using less water, reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So this is a kind of current state. But what's interesting in the sustainability space is really considering the results of a 20, or the implications, I should say, of a 2021 executive order, which by 2045, it will push agencies to have, net zero emissions buildings. So that has, when you think about the, basics of the portfolio, right? Most buildings are emitting some type of emissions, right? Because they tend to have, say, fossil fuel sources on site for cooking or heating. But under the requirements of this executive order, buildings are going to have to be recapitalized to exchange or change out what are currently their say natural gas fired heating systems, and putting in electric boilers for producing heat. And what this does is kind of creates a new capital requirement for buildings. And so the asset managers are going to have to consider this as yet a new need to recapitalize their buildings, to eliminate emitting sources so they can meet the requirements of the executive order. But these kind of introduces some substantial requirements, since it isn't necessarily as simple as changing out, gas boiler with an electric boiler. That often involves going into the distribution into the building and changing out the distribution piping. So this new executive order is kind of imposing some pretty significant requirements on buildings. And this is a report that we did on GSA. And what this graphic shows is that, most of the people that we talk to at the regional level, they're not necessarily confident, given their, past level of funding, that they'll be able to do the work that's needed at their buildings and invest in their buildings to the extent needed to meet the requirements of the executive order by 2045. So this is maybe a little more tempered, a good example about resilience and what the State Department has done. And in this report about that this topic on sustainability, certainly good progress historically had been made by, in this case, the agency was the General Services Administration, but certainly there's some concern going forward about their ability to meet the new sustainability goals that are set forth in a recent executive order. So at this point in the conversation, I'm shifting presenters to Matt Cook joining us from Wisconsin to kind of pick up the conversation on our recent work. And I will pause here to see how the transition works, if there's anything that we need to do back there to.
So let me do a quick test. Can you all hear me?
We can hear Matt, and I will change the slides. I've got the button to change the slides. So I'll sit down and turn it over to you, and I'll just change slides when you need me to.
So Mike, were you going to do the next couple on utilization real quick, or did you want me to cover those?
Yeah, well, I guess I can go ahead.
That's fine. I'll go ahead and do it. That's fine. And I think maybe Keith is in the room too. This is his report. We just wanted to make sure that we added it because it's gotten a lot of press, and it's a pretty important body of work. But it's just the next couple of slides, and I'll just quickly gloss through them, touch upon this analysis that GAO did looking at utilization in federal buildings. I think it's no surprise to many, in this report just put some numbers behind it, that federal buildings are not being used. Even before the pandemic, they weren't being used to their full capacity. And the pandemic really has brought that number down even further. And you can see here in this graphic from that report kind of where agencies land in terms of their utilization percentage of buildings. The graphic does a nice job of showing the 100% and then where they all land. And it just shows you where agencies kind of across the four quarters land, but none of them are getting, above 50 or 60% utilization in any of their buildings. Go ahead, Mike. And then just what's behind that. As I mentioned, this has been an issue since long before the pandemic. It's part of the reason that it's on the high risk list. And buildings are not really configured to ensure maximum utilization. Telecommuting and other factors have increased the usage, or decreased the usage. All right, so with that, I will go to the next slide, which is a little bit more in my wheelhouse. And I should mention, I think I'm okay, but this winter storm has been pretty bad. And if my internet does start to lag or I get delays, please someone let me know, and I'll just start over wherever I left off. So I've done several reports on the federal disposal process, mostly looking at what the next slide is going to talk about on FASTA, which is a piece of legislation from 2016, but let's just set that up really quickly. Disposing of unneeded real property, I don't think it'll be a surprise to most people in the room, is something that the federal government is not very good at. There's a lot of reasons for it. The graphic on the right is intended to, I don't expect anybody to actually read that text, but it's a lot, right? It takes a lot of steps to actually dispose of a federal property, a federal building. Funding is always a consistent theme, and we'll talk about that when we get to deferred maintenance and repair. And then not very many people want federal buildings. There's a lot of unique features about federal buildings, whether they're on a campus or they're located more rurally in parts of or in markets that people don't really want to invest in. It's just hard to get rid of federal properties, and therefore they don't. They just sit, and that's been problematic for a number of years. Next slide. So this is the Federal Asset Sale and Transfer Act, which I mentioned, FASTA. We've done a couple reports on this. This was a pilot program that was created in 2016, which was intended to try and address some of those challenges with the disposal process. Unfortunately, this thing is crashed and burned to a large degree. This graphic, this table here describes some of the reasons. There are 3 rounds as part of this pilot program, none of which have been overly successful. The first round, several properties have been sold, 200 million-ish worth of proceeds have been generated, but even that has been challenged to access that capital to reinvest it and go about disposing additional properties, which is part of the reasons that the next round went so poorly. They weren't able to actually use a lot of that funding to identify and dispose of additional properties. But there's a lot of reasons why. There's a number of stakeholders in this space. They've had challenges working together. GSA, OMB, there was a board that was created under FASTA that have all had their challenges. Agencies, all federal agencies likely have excess properties that they should get rid of, but they're not really incentivized to do so. The pandemic didn't help things. And as I mentioned, the funding mechanism that was created under FASTA didn't really work as intended because it requires a lot of congressional action, and that is always going to be an issue. All right, so let's turn to what I think should be a longer topic, the topic of the day, and that's deferred maintenance and repair. Can you go to the next slide? I won't spend a long time. This graphic has actually made its way through several GAR reports. We kind of continue to reuse it just as an explanation of how you can address DM&R backlogs. Some level of deferred maintenance and repair is obviously expected and even healthy. It allows you to help prioritize and make cost-effective decisions. You don't want to fund some sort of maintenance project if it's not going to be a top priority. Make sure you focus those dollars, which are limited, on the maintenance and repair that needs to be addressed and for those properties that need it. But large and increasing deferred maintenance and repair can and does have significant impacts and hurts agencies' ability to perform their missions. And that's what I want to talk about a little bit more today. Next slide. So GAO has a number of recent reports on deferred maintenance and repair. Just checking the slides aren't forwarding for me. There we go. Including the one that I want to spend the most time on, which is this November report that examined deferred maintenance and repair that Toby and Lindsay worked with me on. And actually, Amelia started out before she retired, so she has some insight on this product as well, and I'm sure she'll share that when we get onto the Q&A portion of this presentation. But I also wanted to highlight that there's a lot of GAO reports that have looked at this issue. There's one on the Department of State that I looked at, that I worked on. There's one for Department of Defense, several recent ones that have to do with the Department of Defense. There's one that looks at the U.S. Coast Guard, and actually one that was released on Monday that goes into more depth on the Department of Interior, looking at federal land management agencies. And so just there's been a large body of work. GAO is aware of this issue and continues to look at it. I will say that the report that I'm about to focus in on is civilian agencies only, and specifically related to 4 selected agencies that I'll get into in one moment. Next slide. So here's the figure that shows where we're going. We're going in the wrong direction in terms of the backlog. Deferred maintenance and repair for all civilian agencies has increased almost 30 billion with a B dollars from 2017 to 2022. The 4 agencies that we selected for our review were large contributors to that, and they're listed here: Department of Energy, Department of Interior, Health and Human Services, and GSA. There were about 22 billion of that. And I will say that these numbers are based off of annual financial reports, which is typically the best source of this information, at least the most consistent source of this information over time. Those reports were just released for 2023 maybe a month or so ago. And it's showing that trend continues to go up. There's about another $6 billion for these 4 agencies, so another 12% increase for 2023. So it just continues to go up and go up. Some of the reasons that have been given when we talk to agencies, and I'll get into all of these a little bit more in depth, is funding constraints coupled with inflation and increased cost of labor and for materials. And then this issue that Mike raised in terms of the vast and diverse portfolio, just managing these assets that have been with the federal government across the country, across the world, as Mike highlighted. There's a large number of them, and they are very old, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Next slide. As far as funding goes, this is something that we wanted to acknowledge, continue to acknowledge up front. As Mike said earlier, agencies, especially at the facilities level, are doing what they can with what they've got. We talked to a number of them. They're really putting their best foot forward. It is very challenging in the current funding environment to address many of these issues. This graph just represents kind of where funding has been over the same period of years. You can see that it's relatively stable just in terms of nominal dollars. And then when you add in inflation, you're losing a lot of purchasing power. We estimated about 26% of your purchasing power has been lost over the last 5 years. Also just acknowledging that there has been a couple of recent pieces of legislation that have infused some funding, right? The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which was 2021, and the Inflation Reduction Act did infuse some capital, some limited capital. These are one-time infusions, not likely to address recurring long-term needs. At this point, it's too early to really see or tell what's going to come from that capital. Next slide. So this is what I was talking about earlier in terms of just the vastness of the portfolio. This looks at both buildings and structures, just to orient you in these figures for a second. So the one on the left is the buildings and the one on the right is structures. There are approximately, across our 4 selected agencies, 58,000 buildings that need to be managed and 96,000 structures. The average age is well over 40 years of those assets, and that creates a number of challenges. When we talked to the Indian Health Service within HHS, they noted that most of their healthcare facilities were built in the 1960s and 1970s. How is it possible to deliver 21st century healthcare when your assets are that old? Bureau of Reclamation within Department of Interior also noted that many of their dams were often built between 1900 and 1950. So trying to maintain those, especially when obtaining parts for outdated equipment, is a challenge. It makes things very difficult. All right, so next slide. Let's talk a little bit more about some of our findings and recommendations. So acknowledging that agencies are often doing what they can, and that they're hamstrung a little bit by the challenges that were just noted. We did identify a couple of areas in which agencies could do a little bit better. Agencies are not helping their cause by providing a clear and transparent picture into their needs. There's not a lot of information in budget materials or their financial statements, and what is there is often confusing to Congress and others, to the public. And we'll get into a couple of those examples here in terms of there's changes from year to year that are often related to methodology decisions, not actual change in the condition of assets. And then within some of the limited data that is available to Congress and the public, agencies don't do a very good job of identifying what the true needs are. I will also say that just to highlight this point about the frustration on the Hill related to the lack of understanding, there is another GAO team from our Natural Resources and Environment group that is testifying in front of the House Natural Resources Committee this morning. Actually, I think it just is about to happen in 3 minutes on federal land management agencies. And this is throughout the statement that's posted to their website. I'll go back and look at the hearing after this, but there's a lot of frustration about the jump in the numbers, what they mean, why are we constantly seeing these numbers go up based on methodology changes and not really understanding what the true deferred maintenance and repair needs are. I will also note that under federal accounting standards, we use, as I said, the annual financial reports for a lot of this information. Agencies are granted a lot of latitude, so they're not doing anything technically wrong. It's just made it very difficult to understand actually what those DMNR needs are. And we also want to bring OMB in here as well, right? They have a role to play in terms of directing agencies to provide some level of information, some details on what those DMNR needs are. And we do have a recommendation, I'll get to that in a minute, related to them in terms of making sure that agencies understand what is helpful, how to present that information to Congress so that they can get what they need in order to make their jobs easier. All right, next slide. All right, so this is one of the things that I wanted to highlight in terms of the confusion. For most of the agencies, there were large changes, but they went all sorts of different directions. This is for each year. This describes the change that goes up and down for individual agencies. You can see that the percentage changes very widely. You even have some negatives in some years, some decrease in the DMNR estimates. But there's no real explanation for that. When we talk to agencies, and when I say that, I mean in the financial statements. When we talk to agencies, they often were able to provide some answers, but most of them oftentimes were related to just decisions about methodology, right? How they calculated the estimates. One example is that there was a 40% increase in the Department of Interior's DMNR estimates from fiscal years 2020 through 2021. But that was mostly due to adding design, compliance, and construction management costs to the National Park Service estimates specifically. GSA's estimate has increased more than 30% between 2019 and 2020. That was due to a decision to rebaseline. That's why that number increased so dramatically. So that's contributing to the confusion on what the actual needs are. Next slide. For the raw number, the total number itself, agencies are not clearly communicating what is included. There's some examples here. The picture on the left is a steam plant where deferred maintenance and repair has been deliberately deferred, but it is still reported. The agency just doesn't see a need to fund any of that. That's not actually a pressing need or priority, but it's still part of the total DMNR, and there's a lot of examples of this. The reason this steam plant is sitting there is because it's part of a planned recapitalization project, right? Why invest dollars when you're going to replace it? But it's hard for Congress to understand that when you're just reporting a raw number. There's other examples on the right. That picture is a picture of the Folsom Dam from the Bureau of Reclamation, and it shows the dam's temperature control devices. Those are those shutters that you can see there. And those were constructed around 1950, and there is a plan to replace them in the next 5 years, but there's obviously a lot of deferred maintenance and repair there that is being reported. It's just the agency doesn't want to put any additional funding into maintaining them or addressing the backlog on them if they're going to replace them. And then the last category I'll note is that the DM&R totals include a lot of inactive or excess assets, so things that the agency just has closed the doors on, but you still have to report that DM&R. So there's no intention to ever actually provide dollars for projects related to DM&R, but it is still included in the totals that are reported to Congress. All right, next slide. Okay, so this is an analysis that we did using the leading practices for managing deferred maintenance and repair. These practices, we've used these. They were first, and I think John Bachman is on this call. He'll love that I continue to bring this up. But there's a 2014 report where these were developed. They're based in large part on National Academies studies, and I know that Mike and Jack are going to present the body of work going back to the 1990s. And then also based on ISO standards and related to the asset management framework that Amelia helped develop and was noted earlier in the presentation in GAO 1957. There are 9 of these. We chose 5 of them to apply in this case, just because we were focused more on how agencies are prioritizing deferred maintenance and repair. And I will note that I think we can all agree that, and I know Mike and Jack will talk later, agencies' missions are not aligned with agencies' portfolios are not aligned with mission needs. You'll see that agencies all got credit there. Our review was looking at the low-hanging fruit in terms of policies and procedures. Do you even have a policy and procedure to address some of these issues? And that's why they're getting credit there. We have a large body of work on how agencies' portfolios are not aligned with their mission needs, particularly as we talked about earlier on disposing of unneeded assets. But I do want to focus on the last 2 leading practices where we did identify some deficiencies and made some recommendations. Next slide. So budget structure. This again gets back to transparency with Congress and what do you need. One of the leading practices has to do with differentiating between routine and preventative maintenance and what has been deferred maintenance and repair within your budget and your budget documentation to ensure that both of those areas are sufficiently funded and that decisions to address the backlog don't negatively impact your routine maintenance and repair. Most agencies do include the overall funding for their maintenance in their budgets, but do not identify what they need to address the backlog, or at least reduce the backlog, right? As we said, you're never going to totally get rid of it. It's healthy to have a little bit of a backlog, but with skyrocketing numbers, significant expansion of those backlogs, agencies are not providing Congress with the level of information they need in order to understand that. We also noted that they don't really have a plan as part of that budget to reduce the backlogs with an estimated funding needs and timeframes that might give Congress and other stakeholders insight into their needs. And then as a queue up for the next presentation, I wanted to just highlight that this is very much in lines with findings presented in that National Academies report on strategies to renew federal facilities. Next slide. So predictive modeling. Leading practices state that agencies should use predictive modeling to predict the future condition and performance of their assets as portfolios, right? To really understand the priorities and to ensure that their investment decisions are aligned with agency missions and goals. Most agencies do use some level of models, mostly at the facility level. But they don't really look forward. They're not forward-looking, and they're definitely not, and this goes to the larger point that we've all kind of raised throughout this presentation, they're not looking across their portfolio in terms of managing as far as an asset management approach is concerned. Predictive models really could help agencies prioritize among their competing investments. But we also want to acknowledge, and agencies raised this a number of times, that there are challenges with using these models. Again, this is highlighted in the National Academy study that we're about to talk about. The data is often not there. There's also a lot of cost to acquire and use these models, train staff and the like. So there is a little bit of a trade-off there as well. And then last slide. So no surprise, we made a few recommendations cutting across our 4 selected agencies. One has to do with transparency. You know, as we've acknowledged, funding is always an issue, but agencies really need to help Congress. They need to guide them and provide them with accurate information on what their deferred maintenance and repair backlog is. We also made a recommendation to OMB on the instructions provided to agencies, just to make sure that agencies are aware of what is needed, providing that level of support. And then the other 2 recommendations have to do with what I just talked about in terms of structuring of their budgets and then using predictive models to make investment decisions. So I know that we're over. I was told that we were deferring the break for a little bit, so thanks for hanging with me. But I will now pause and open up the floor if there are questions or other things that we want to get into.
You're not over. We're late, so thank you for being respectful of that. We will take a break at 10:30, but Amelia, do you want to?
Yeah. I just wanted to make a few comments. First of all, you showcase such a large body of work. There's a lot to talk about, but I'm just going to make a few high-level comments. And also the reports that Mike and Matt highlighted, we have other related work. So for example, in the disposal process, we have a report that talks about Title V of McKinney-Vento, which requires that federal properties be available for homeless before they can be disposed of. So there are a lot of other details here that we don't have time to cover. And I just want to make a few comments that could you move to the asset management framework? I think it was slide 6. Is that 6 or 7? Yeah, I think it's 6, the one before this. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So a lot of what you're talking about is managing assets, and this fits right within the asset management framework. I hope you all can see it. Some of the text is a little small, but the asset management framework does have managing assets incorporated within it, which if you look at the first line of boxes, asset management strategy and planning, that includes decision-making process, risk management, capital planning, and data and information. And Matt mentioned lack of data or not good quality data. And then the second line, asset lifecycle delivery, the second line of boxes, acquire, operate, maintain, and dispose is a lot of the work that you've covered here. So managing assets definitely fits within the asset management framework, but the asset management framework is a more holistic approach. And I think that Jack Dempsey is going to talk about that when he talks about the strategies report. But some of the key, if you can go to the next slide, some of the key characteristics of the asset management framework, which I know are a little hard to read here, but 2 of them are really important to what Matt just spoke about, which is quality data. And you really need to be using quality data. So what Matt was saying is that not all of these agencies had quality data, which makes it very difficult to make decisions. And then the other one, maximizing an asset portfolio's value, is also what you talked about in to do with the leading practices and some of the recommendations you made and some of the models. So if you don't have a strong model, it's very difficult to maximize the portfolio's value. And I know you have a recommendation on the models also. A couple things, well, just to go back to the 4 agencies that were studied in the deferred maintenance report and how they do capture the majority of deferred maintenance in the federal government because they were such large agencies. So DOE, HHS, GSA, and DOI, I think I calculated it was about 76%. Anyway, it's a very large proportion of deferred maintenance for the entire of civilian agencies. So I think it was 76%. I don't have that slide right in front of me, but so you did cover, a really large proportion of the deferred maintenance dollars. And as you said, not all of that, there's an issue with categorization, there's an issue with definitions. But basically, you made recommendations to all of those agencies. And I know that some of those agencies are going to be speaking this afternoon. I know that DOI, Bureau of Reclamation, and GSA will be speaking. I also know that I believe a number of DOE representatives are on the Zoom call or signed up for the signed up to attend. So everyone is welcome to comment on who's on the Zoom call. But although I think we're showcasing some of them as good examples, we also have GAO also does have recommendations to each of those agencies. So one other comment that I wanted to make, which is not popular, I know, but when I was at the Office of Management and Budget for the City of New York, we continually found that increased funding did not necessarily lead to better outcomes. So while there is a need for funding, there are a lot of other things that need to be done, which are covered in this asset management framework. So I think now I'll just open up and see if we have other questions.
Yes, thank you all. And all right, there's a couple things here. I'm gonna put, first, let me ask Amelia. I noticed that in the recommendations, the alignment of what was being said to ISO 55,000.
Oh, yeah.
Will you comment on
Right.
that?
Well, yes, well, yeah. If you go to the previous, can you go to the previous slide? This asset management framework that we developed in GAO 1957, now, gosh, I guess it's 5 years ago. This is based on ISO 55,000 standards, as well as a whole series of interviews we had with experts and review of literature. But this is really critical that the ISO 55,000 standards, you know, are guiding this framework and guiding. I think Jack Dempsey is going to talk a little bit more about that this afternoon, but that's mentioned in the strategies report. So that's kind of key. That's underpinning a lot of the discussion about asset management.
Okay, and then to the GAO, how much are you aware of ISO 55,000, and did any of that come into your recommendations? Is there a direct relationship, or is it that ISO 55,000 is based on common sense issues, just well organized and collected? So Mike and Matt, and then Toby, Gillett, if you could comment on that also.
We are somewhat limited as an agency and you know, and well, not limited, but we have a challenge, I guess, in trying to pull from different bodies of work and trying to establish what are best practices in a specific area. So ISO 55,000 certainly informed our thinking on and continues to do so, right, on all the work we do looking at federal property and asset management issues. And I think to specifically address your question, that the closest connection may be through the closest connection to ISO 55,000. And I think if you look at the website, we actually reference that as a something that we investigated in producing this report back in 2019. So. And this report, as I kind of alluded to in my presentation, that this is one of the our reports, kind of different shapes and sizes, and some are say more important than others. But I think this report stands as one of our most important reports in the area of asset management, and in that ISO 55,000 was one of the main bodies of work that, say, Amelia considered in producing this. I think it's fair to say that the concepts of 55,000 and reflected through this report that we continue to use and referencing in the work that's followed. I think there are some clear connections to ISO 55,000.
Well, I think you've addressed that question, and we could ask Matt and Toby another question. In terms of the recommendations, did those, are any of those influenced by best practices you have seen from federal agencies? Matt, if you could go first.
Yeah, sure. That's fine. Yeah, these, as I mentioned, these leading practices were developed almost a decade ago at this point, although they have evolved over time in terms of how we implement them and apply them. And yes, there are examples, and that's why you see like some of that graphic that I put up there, where there's like a half circle where agencies are kind of getting part of the way there in terms of how they structure their budgets or their use of predictive modeling. So there are some of those examples, but I'll turn to Toby and see if he wants to highlight any of those.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, the recommendations were largely based on the ones that come from these leading practices. These leading practices, as Matt listed earlier, are largely based on National Academies reports. When we were looking at the reporting, the information reported in the annual financial reports, we certainly saw that some agencies did a better job than others, you might say. I think we called out in the report, the Department of Energy, for example, I think did, we still made a recommendation, but it was a more detailed set of information that they reported in their annual financial reports than the other agencies provided. So our recommendation to the Department of Energy is less extensive than it is to the other agencies. So certainly there are some agencies that you could say have best leading practices that other agencies could look at.